Yeah, the favorite picture. It's also the picture that that Julie and I have used in a paper that we wrote together with colleagues a couple of years ago about these paradoxes, and that got it all started. That nice painting by Dutch artist Escher, I guess. Few words about myself. I will do that in a minute. And what we hope is that you find back these elements throughout the presentations, also of the others. Basic questions you ask, like the substance, which kind of paradoxes do we encounter? That is something that's relevant to ask yourself. What's also relevant is, which is a separate line of questions. What do you do with it then methodologically? And then a third set of questions, how does that practically matter? And I think Julie and I already agreed that we were a bit surprised that the presentations by our dear professors, that they had a lot to say about that question 4, and not always that much on question 3, which was at least a bit of a surprise for us. Yeah, then about myself. Well, I'm Bonno. I work in Brussels, Sustainable Development Institute. Background in environmental planning and political philosophy. It's the latter part that I guess generates the paradoxes interest. At least in planning, we don't do a lot with paradoxes. We just try to resolve things. I did my PhD thesis in Rotterdam, public administration. That's also how I know Julia, by the way. Governance of complex systems. And my promoter was already very into the mode of paradoxical thinking, always emphasizing that management, public management, that it's always a matter of somehow reconciling opposites, a bit to the same school of thought as Professor Wesley, actually. And Professor Thijsman and me, what we had from the beginning on is that whatever our dear colleagues from Drift were saying in their activism, that what we shared is a lot is this is those ambiguities that you have in transitions, that two-sided perspective, which at least I personally really like to take as a chess player. The basic lesson that you learn every time again is that the same position looks differently when you walk to the other side of the board, and it's that two-sided view that I really started to like a lot. Yeah, then the case. I will try not to say too much about the empirical details about this, because what I would try to bring across is, I mean, it's a fascinating case, it's an important case, but it's also a case that you can use as a kind of test for all kinds of methodologies that contain certain lessons about paradox and transitions, and how do you how you can analyze it methodologically. So I'll be running a bit fast through the case description itself. So this is in Rotterdam. You see it on that little picture with the colors. Those are concentrations of either fine dust or NO2. I'm not actually sure. But in any case, it's pollution related to the highways. What you had in the marked area is that researchers were conducting research on the health effects of traffic there. There was quite some activism there on the health hazards from that highway, because you can see the houses are very close to that highway there. There was a campaign that started, Rij schoner, drive cleaner, keep it to the 80. Then there was the legislation that it was found out that something had to be done really urgently about the pollution because it was way above the ceilings. And that is what Then they decided to go for an experiment, namely reduce the maximum speed to 80 rather than the 120 kilometers an hour that you had before. So they did an experiment of reducing the speeds, which would also reduced the pollution, which was a success. So it turned a permanent measure. And then you had more of these zones for similar problems in other cities in the Netherlands. So, well, great. Niche innovation, upscaling, green traffic management, all right. Except that the story was not over yet. You can see it a little bit on that map already. So there was this upscaling. But then there was this moment like, hey, wait a second, we are getting a huge congestion on these roads. This is not at all a good idea. So we have to immediately get rid of these 80 zones. So there was a phase out, back to original speed, then legal battles about this. Then what you got is that on certain sections, you had even an increase of speed. And there it starts to get really bizarre and paradoxical. Then you got these kinds of publicity, election campaign slogans of the liberals advertising the increase of speed. This was the minister at the time on your left, Minister of Transport, who also made a kind of an election campaign out of this as well. And in recent elections, there were even some appeals on the ultra right to go German, so to say, to go for a complete liberalization of speed limits. So that's kind of an anticlimax. And there you have that paradox. Principle on successful measure, because you had this upscaling. And also the way in which the political support was created to get that upscaling, that was really well, a classic example of how you should do transition experiments. It was quite impressive. But then it ended up in its opposite. So that's the paradox that I think that we can see here. First it goes down and then it goes up. And in transitions research, that has been described as transitions backlash. So there's a paradox, the success that turned into its inverse, but later on I would like to discuss a little bit as well that even that paradox, that's a bit more complicated than that, because it is not a complete turning into its inverse. It's very difficult to assess what this experiment has brought to sustainable mobility in the Netherlands. It depends a bit on how you look at it. So yeah, maybe it was partly successful, maybe it was backlash. Maybe if you look on a longer time scale, maybe it is not so paradoxical anymore. It's a bit that theme that also Professor Sterling brought up. Yes, there is a certain paradox that you can see out there, but the paradox that you see out there in the case, that also depends a bit on how you look at it as a researcher. So you always, when you think that you perceive a certain paradox in your case, that's immediately a next question that comes up: on what basis do you actually conclude that that is a paradox? Under what assumptions is that? I think that it's in any case interesting to approach this as a paradoxical innovation, and an innovation that is paradoxical in the sense that you have this backlash phenomenon of going up and then back. And as transitions researcher, I think it's kind of obvious or normal to ask to approach it a bit like this, like, okay, it's a backlash, it turns in its inverse this initial success. How can we explain this, and what can we do about it? Seems like a normal practical question to ask. Yeah, so how to approach this this paradox of these 80-kilometer zones, how to approach that methodologically. The first thing to say about this, I did this in the course of my PhD research, and I defended my PhD in 2012. So I've had about a decade to think further about this. And I've not even published that analysis yet. It's still work in progress. So also all these things that I'm saying about the paradox in this case, at the moment that I was defending my PhD thesis in September 2012, it was precisely in that month that it started to become clear that 130 zones, that was coming. So I've passed a lot of time not at all being aware of that. It only came afterwards. And because I took so long, because I've wasted so much time on this case, that's allowed me to take different approaches on the same case. Normally, I would have been satisfied with just the first. That is how I did it for my PhD thesis, an analysis of along the sociology of translations, kind of social construction of technology, and the style of Latour and Calon, if that is known to you. Later, causal process tracing, because I wanted to explain more. And after that, I realized, okay, but it's causal process tracing, it's not entirely satisfying either. So kinds of reflexive methodology that I try to apply to this case. And in any case, I'd like to share with you what these three different kinds of methods, what they have to bring in analyzing this case and this paradox. So the first, this is the one that I started with, and this is also the one that I concluded with in my PhD thesis. It starts with a very innovation sociological approach. You can ask yourself, how do niches diffuse? It's a very common question in transitions research. But from a constructivist perspective, it is always emphasized by innovation sociologists. No, it's not just diffusion, it's translation that you need to look at. You have different actors in society, different institutions, innovations there. It's not a matter of just adopting them, but actors, they appropriate them, they adapt them, they frame them, they translate them. So you need to look at the different actors in society, like that minister that you see on the picture from the right-wing liberals, who had a particular understanding of the 80-kilometer zones, who had a particular way of talking about them, who had particular performance criteria that she kept coming up with, like, hey, what are the congestion effects? Yeah, okay, environmental effects, that's important, but what about the congestion effects? How does it disturb car drivers? Is this reasonable to ask from people on the road? And the activists above, they have, of course, different understandings of what this innovation is. So they have different translations of that thing that we are talking about here. And that is something that you should be studying. So there I followed Madeleine Erkrich, Bruno Latour, Michel Calon, if this is known to you, constructivist approaches to innovation. Also some insights on institutional complexity that further underlines there's different kinds of actors involved with this, and understanding the different kinds of actors involved is also a way of gaining an understanding of the complexity of the innovation process and gaining an understanding of the paradoxes that you might come across. So that's how I looked in the beginning at these 80-kilometer zones, that they were a kind of a battlefield of different kinds of translations, that there were different ways in which actors with different interests try to push it in their direction, to instrumentalize it for their particular political programs. Also an approach that has been used a lot by Adriaan Smith. So what did I do? I followed the actors in Latour fashion. I followed a bit the methodological guidelines of Wiebe Bijker and John Law of the social construction of technology. There's different kinds of qualitative data that I used for that. In this case, there was really a lot. So there's different adaptations and translations of these innovations that I could reconstruct over time. What did that yield? Yeah, first of all, that thing that you see on the right, these kind of diagrams, different kinds of translations by different kinds of actors, and I didn't really I couldn't get that to work really. I did get an understanding of the complexity, but I didn't see any patterns. I did get a good understanding of the different kind of interests involved and the different kind of actors and what they expected from these zones and why they didn't like the zones, or why they did like them. I did get an understanding of the surrounding institutional tensions. And in that sense, it is also this qualitative analysis, this analysis of the different interests of the actors involved, it did help me to get some basic awareness of the paradoxical nature of this innovation. It is a bit in line with what Professor Wesley said also about how many innovations, how they tend to be attempts to reconcile different conflicting interests. In this case, the interest of having ongoing mobility, whilst at the same time also maintaining certain standards of, well, environmental standards, but also health standards in this case. And the balancing in between, well, you can appreciate the 80-kilometer zones as some kind of innovation that was driven by out of a kind of a desperate situation in which it proved impossible to meet both the environmental and the mobility interests. And that awareness of that paradox, it came to me through that qualitative analysis. So in that sense, I can recommend this kind of translation analysis as a way to get these paradoxes on the table. I think that Frances Wesley called it a synchronic approach. She talked about the diachronic and synchronic, I think. It was not the diachronic, so it was the other one. You can look it up in her presentation. Yeah, now the second one. The causal process tracing. I guess that is something that is familiar to most of you. Because in any case, causal process tracing, that is basically the kind of analysis that led people like Frank Geels and Johan Schott and the others to their typology of transition pathways. All this is in the end based on forms of causal process tracing, trying to reconstruct patterns in transitions and trying to reconstruct what causal mechanisms are underlying these patterns. Well, at a certain point, I thought I should be able to do that too. I should do that too, and not only that constructivist approach that I liked in the beginning. Because this is what it delivered, that qualitative analysis. It delivered certain things, it brought me certain insights, qualitative insights, insights about governance dynamics. But on this question, how can we actually avoid this backlash? It did not say a lot. Because it didn't give me anything to predict transitions backlash. It didn't give me anything to explain this. So in the end, I wanted to move from a more qualitative to a more explanatory analysis. So how and under what conditions do you get these kind of process outcomes? That's the typical kind of questions that a lot of transitions researchers ask. So that led me to the step 2 in my methodology. Only quite recently, indeed. So it took me really a long time to get there. I need to say. So yeah, how to explain process outcomes. The good thing is that this causal process tracing, you can read this back. Blatter and Haverland I have referenced, but also the work of Geels and Schot is very insightful about how to do this. This is very well established. There are recipes that are relatively easy to follow, I need to say. So I can definitely recommend reading some of these works that I reference here, to at least, even if you don't apply it, to just have a look at the logic that this follows and the kind of procedures that they follow, because it's actually quite neat and it can be quite fun to do. At least I enjoyed it. Underlying idea behind that causal process tracing is that that reality, that it's important to look at it not as a thing that is static, but as something that is constantly moving. That is for transitions researchers, I guess, not very new. I guess that's why we study transitions, because they are dynamic and because we are interested in change. So here I can be a bit quicker, I guess. You can read this back in the early works of Frank Geels and Schot as well. The importance of developing a dynamic view on societal reality. And this is also this appreciation of dynamics that is also very much helping towards an understanding of the different kinds of paradoxes that you come across. That is also what especially Francis Wesley did very explicitly, taking such a process perspective. So what you do, you look at sequences of linked events over time. Also, that article by Pettigrew is very easy to follow, I think, and very good to lead you into the basics of process analysis, why you do it and how you do it. And basically what this process analysis does is what you see in that transitions diagram. It turns your case into combination of different arrows. It gives a very dynamic representation of the case that you're studying. And that is what transitions thinking is about, I guess, is that we are really interested in all these many arrows, how they work together, and how they together form bigger patterns and even system transitions. And the underlying methodology is process tracing. So how do you do that? It's a matter of thinking in terms of processes and talking in terms of processes, talking not about things, but talking about activities and processes and things that change, talking not about being, but talking about things that become, or things that's about things that cease to be like this or like that. There are certain principles you can follow for process analysis that Pettigrew has outlined. I'm trying to just to show that with regard to the specific case. You can read this back in the work of Pettigrew and more generally in methodological literature on process tracing. For example, temporal interconnectedness between past, present, and future. In the end, it is as simple as you can look at your case as a network of different actors, as I did in the beginning with these different translations. You can also try to put it on a timeline, put that timeline in front of you on a screen and just look at it for a long time, start marking a bit like what happened on that timeline. Hey, I forgot that. Oh yeah, that's also happened, and that also happened, but what is really the important event here, or where did things really start to change? Already putting things on a timeline is just something that pushes you into a kind of a mindset, a kind of processual, time-oriented thinking that is illuminating a lot of things about transition cases. It's just always good to do, even if you're inclined to another kinds of analysis. I think it's always a good exercise to do if you have some data that you have collected over a longer time period. So how do you do that? Yeah, it's getting into that process mindset. Looking at it in terms of these arrows that you can see in that little diagram of the transitions. Try to picture it as a kind of a set of arrows. Try to look at it a bit as a stream that branches over time into little substreams, where you can start to think about, okay, this is the main change that I'm following, but it's connected to little changes that come together. It is that mindset that causal process tracing is based on. You can do that descriptively. You can describe different kind of actions taken, decisions taken, changes in circumstances that drive actors to take certain decisions. You can also, these translations that I talk about, you can put them in a temporal order on a timeline. Can distinguish different kinds of events that may happen, like conflict that arises, or reconciliation, or joining of forces, or a new actor joining the scene, joining the process, or exiting from the process. And in the end, you can start to figure out some patterns. And at the moment that you start to see some patterns, then that's where the reconstruction of causality sets in. That's the exciting part. Yeah, as I said, Blatter and Haveland are amongst the people. They were former colleagues of mine, so I could talk to them. That helped. who have explained that in a very systematic and easy to follow way, how you can do that in steps, the causal process tracing. So what they say, what you should look at is the critical turns on a timeline, those events or those moments on a timeline that you think like, oh, but there's something really changed significantly. For example, the moment that the 80 zones experiment, that it became a permanent measure, then something really significantly changes, or the moment that it was decided by the minister to scale it up or to phase it out. That's relatively straightforward. There's different phases you can then distinguish on your timeline. There's different conditions and underlying mechanisms that you can distinguish. Well, transitions research has a lot of ideas about that, about the kinds of conditions that matter, so the kinds of mechanisms that you have. You have these transition typologies. That already tells us how you can reconstruct a transitions process. It has all been done before. Well, you should look for smoking guns, so some kind of tangible evidence that tells you that event 1 is somehow connected to event 2. That is easy for me to say, but there it gets a bit tricky, of course, because what is really proving what? If you are a bit philosophical minded, then you will always doubt, of course, is this really a smoking gun? Does that really prove it? I guess it's good to ask yourself these questions, but in principle, in this case, a smoking gun, there were reports at a certain moment that just counted that in 2005, 2 months, 3 months after the start of one of these new 80-kilometer zones, that the congestion figures, that they almost doubled. And subsequently, the minister and people in parliament started waving with this evidence. And quite soon after, there were votes, and there was a ministerial decision to reconsider these zones. I guess that comes pretty close to a smoking gun. There you can see there's just a almost undeniable causal connection between the one and the other. And you can back that up with confessions. There's just actors. If you interview them, there's actors who also talk in the media that gives indications of why they decided for what or against what, which gives further backing up in your reconstruction of how events are related. Yeah, this is taken from my PhD thesis. So I could reconstruct what happened. That is what that qualitative analysis also does. Different kinds of translations, different kinds of actors doing things in certain moments. Yeah, that stopped in 2010. That was a bit, that is how it is. But at that moment, the paradox had not even surfaced yet. So after that, I've tried to extend that timeline a bit, and now I want to extend it more until 2022 or something.
Bonno, could you finish up in about 5 minutes so we have enough for the questions? Thanks.
Yes. So this is a bit how this then visually works, what I just talked about. You can put things on a timeline. You can look at how the things are connected. You can distinguish certain phases. On the basis of these phases, you can then reconstruct, like, okay, why is it precisely that that the innovation went from one phase into the other? What could be the causal connections between these phases? And on the basis of that, after a lot of iteration, of course, you can come to critical conditions that lead one to a certain process outcome. I came to these, and I won't be talking about them in any detail, but it is through these kind of procedures that you can get to explanations of critical conditions. That has been done before, which is nice. Then you have the critical conditions, because that means, well, then you can also more or less predict and avoid backlash outcomes. But is backlash, is that really what we're seeing here? What is the outcome that we're really seeing here? Is everybody agreeing about that? Is it not the case that this whole idea of a backlash, yeah, okay, the speed limit, it went up again, but on the other hand, a lot of things have been learned about this innovation. A lot of other green innovations in traffic have been inspired by this innovation. The whole idea that traffic that it generates health hazards has become a big issue in the Netherlands. It has enormously risen on the political agenda. There are certain positive results in terms of transition as well. So if we go back to that paradox, maybe it is not simply, well, okay, it is not that S-curve that we're seeing, it's something, it's the opposite of that, it's something very negative, but what is it really? Is it this backlash, or does it in the end go up again? Or should we even be more negative about this than backlash? But if you start drawing these time diagrams of your paradox case, backlash, that suggests that on the axis of the system change that it has gone down. But what do we mean with that, and who says? So which of these horizontal lines are we assuming there, and on which basis do you put the outcome of this paradoxical innovation trajectory, and what basis do you put it above backlash, on backlash, on or below? That is something that methodologically you need to account for, because all the actors involved, they don't have the same idea about this. It's debatable what the outcome was actually. And in the same way, also on the timeline, as I said, in 2012, I had certain conclusions about this case. And then the paradox was not even clear yet. And now I'm telling you about this case. And in 5 years' time, I might say something else about this case. And I might go back in time to 1960 or something, when this road also existed. And maybe if you look from 1960 until now, you see just a kind of a flat line, and there's not so much of a paradox. There's just mainly a lot of continuity that you see. So all these process explanations, they presuppose some kind of, there's certain assumptions that go into them. Almost there, Julia and others. So there is a third layer of methodology that I think is important. It's important to look at your framing of your process analysis. You need to account for the position of the researcher. It's important to question the implicit assumptions about your Y and your X-axis. You need to ask questions about what is the system here actually, who says actually what is the purpose of this 80-kilometer zones actually? How can you decide that as a researcher where you start your analysis? Well, here's some examples. Again, professors Adriaan and Andy have done a lot of interesting analysis along these lines of questions, and they come back when you start to do causal process tracing, because it introduces some basic questions on, well, what's the kind of regime that we are describing here? What is the outcome? What are your assumptions of duration and tempo and time frame? All these questions, they come up. And is it actually reasonable to put up the timeline as I showed it to you? So there's these three method approaches that I used, and I think that it is not a good idea to try to apply them, all three of them, in one analysis. It leads to too long presentations. I'm really sorry for that. It leads to too long PhD projects, and it leads to too long articles. But I would say that it is nice idea to choose one of the three and try to combine it with a second of the three as a way to do some kind of method triangulation or find some kind of synergy. Because in that way you do get a richer understanding of the paradoxes involved, which I think is a bit similar to this idea of synchronic and diachronic analysis that Francis Wesley proposed. That has some similar kind of combination. Practical implications, I'm just going to skip that. We will come to that anyway. Well, just look at these people. They are very practically involved. It should have been clear by now anyway. How it all matters a lot, how you frame your case as a researcher, and how that makes a certain political difference when you start to talk about this, or when you start to advocate these zones, or say 80-kilometer zones. Well, that was not such a good idea. And here's some references.